Jed Carver wasn't looking to save anyone. Not anymore. The sky above was nothing but a dull canvas of steel gray, streaked with dust, just like the thoughts in his head. It had been nearly 5 years since he buried his wife and their unborn child on a cold hilltop near Abilene. He'd never returned to that spot, never said a prayer since. He figured if God had been watching then, he'd already made up his mind. Now Jed rode alone, not looking for salvation or comfort, just cattle. That was all he had left. On this particular afternoon, Jed was tracking strays after a bad lightning storm had split his herd near the Palo Pinto Hills. His horse, Thorn, snorted uneasily as they edged down into a narrow, brush-filled gulch where the land dipped like a scar across the plains. That's when he saw a wagon, tipped on its side, half covered in ash and prairie grass. As if nature was trying to swallow the memory of it whole, Jed dismounted slowly, rifle loose in his hand, eyes scanning the terrain. Something felt wrong. The wagon's wheel was splintered, the canvas shredded, and most of the supplies scattered or burned. It wasn't just a wreck, it was a message. Someone had done this. He moved closer, checking for signs of life or death. No bodies, no fresh blood, but the silence was unnerving. He crouched low near the remains of the fire pit. Cold, at least a day old. Then he heard a faint rustling behind the brush. Jed froze, his finger twitching near the trigger. A sound. A cough? No, something softer. He parted the thorns, and that's when he saw them. 3 children. Dirty, skinny, and sitting close together beneath a ragged quilt that couldn't keep out the wind, let alone the chill of fear in their bones. The oldest, a girl, maybe 9 or 10, had her arms around the others protectively. A boy, 6 perhaps, with a scraped knee and haunted eyes, clung to her side. And the youngest, a tiny girl with stick-thin arms and a mouth smeared with what looked like dried peach jam, stared up at him like he was part of a dream. Jed opened his mouth to say something, but before he could form the words, the littlest one beat him to it. "We don't cry if you let us eat," she said, just like that. 7 words, spoken so simply, without tears, without expectation. It cracked something in Jed that hadn't moved in years. He knelt beside them, slow and cautious, like he might scare them off if he breathed too loud. "You hurt?" he asked gently, looking them over. The oldest shook her head no, though Jed could see her lip was busted and one of her shoes had dried blood on it. "Where's your May and Pa?" He tried. No one answered. The little girl rested her cheek against her sister's shoulder, and the boy looked away, jaw clenched like he might punch something if he wasn't so hungry. Jed sighed and reached into his saddlebag. He pulled out a wrapped biscuit and tore it in half, offering it to the smallest one first. She took it with both hands like it was gold. The others didn't wait for an invitation after that. As they ate in silence, he sat nearby, watching them more than anything. No sobbing, no whining. Just chewing and quiet, grateful eyes that didn't trust him yet, but weren't scared of him either. That said something. He didn't know what to do. He hadn't taken care of anyone in years. His house was barely clean. His pantry was mostly dried beans and cornmeal, and the ranch hands didn't exactly have warm hearts. But leaving them here? After hearing that sentence? "We don't cry if you let us eat." Jed knew the kind of hunger that gnawed more than your belly. He remembered his mama counting beans, watering down soup so the kids could eat, telling them not to cry because men don't. But even then, she'd tuck them in at night. She'd kiss their heads and prayed over their plates. These kids? They looked like they hadn't been tucked in for weeks, maybe months. He stood and motioned toward his horse. "Come on, let's get you warm." The oldest girl hesitated, glancing at the other two. "You gonna take us to the sheriff?" she asked. Jed shook his head. "Not unless you want me to. Just taking you home, to my place. You can rest, eat something hot. That's all. Finally, the children stood. The boy carried the baby on his back, and the girl held her sister's hand like a mother would. Jed helped them onto the saddle and walked beside the horse, not trusting Thorn with the precious load just yet. As they crested the hill, the wind picked up behind them, blowing dust into the bones of the broken wagon, and with it, the past that tried to bury those kids in silence. Jed glanced at the smallest one. Her eyes were closing as she leaned into her sister. For the first time in years, Jed Carver whispered a prayer. Not for himself, for them. And it started with 7 words he'd never forget. We don't cry if you let us eat. Jed Carver had never felt so unsure of what he was doing in his entire life. Not even during the war, when cannon fire shook the earth and men screamed for their mothers. At least then, he had orders, purpose. Now he was leading 3 starving children into his dusty ranch with no clue what came next. They didn't talk much on the ride. The oldest girl, Susie, kept her arms wrapped around her siblings like a mother bear shielding her cubs. Her eyes were far too old for her age, and her jaw never unclenched. Eli, the boy, was quiet but twitchy. His eyes moved, constantly scanning the landscape like something might jump from behind the mesquite. And the littlest, the one who had spoken that sentence that gutted Jed? She fell asleep halfway home, head bobbing gently with each step the horse took. Yet's ranch sat nestled between 2 dry hills, a few miles outside of Cooper's Hollow. It wasn't much: a sagging porch, a lopsided barn, a weather-beaten windmill that creaked when the wind came just right. But it was safe, quiet, and it had a stove that still worked and a root cellar with canned peaches that hadn't been touched. In over a year, the moment they arrived, Jed lifted each child down one by one and opened the door to his modest cabin. The smell of leather, coffee grounds, and pine soot hit them first. The children paused just inside the threshold, eyes wide like they weren't sure if they were allowed to cross the line into something warm and solid. You can sit, Jed said, his voice softer than he expected. Ain't fancy, but it's home. Susie motioned her siblings forward. Eli settled onto the wooden bench near the hearth, while the littlest girl, who still hadn't given her name, curled up on a bearskin rug, like she'd been waiting for that very moment for days. Jed moved to the stove, setting a pot of water to boil. He hadn't planned on company, let alone 3 starving children, but he'd figure it out. He poured oats into a tin pot and added honey and a splash of milk. As it warmed, he found himself humming without realizing it. When he set the bowls in front of them, the silence was almost holy. The children didn't speak. They didn't look at each other. They just ate slowly, respectfully, like they were afraid it might be taken away if they made a fuss. And when they were done, Susie stood, picked up all 3 bowls, and carried them to the sink. You don't have to, Jed started. She cut him off with a glance. Mama always said if someone feeds you, you clean the dish. That was the first thing she said since they left the gulch. Jed nodded, leaning against the counter. Where is your mama? He asked gently. Susie froze. Eli's spoon clattered to the floor, and the littlest girl, who had just begun to smile, went still as stone. She said she'd find us later, Susie said. Her voice was too even, too practiced. She went to get help. Jed didn't push further. He'd been around enough shell-shocked men to recognize when someone was holding a story too big to carry out loud. Later, while the kids napped wrapped in old quilts on the floor, Jed stepped out onto the porch. The sun was dipping low, painting the land in amber. Wind stirred dust through the dry grass, and in the quiet, his thoughts turned heavy. Who were these kids really? What happened to their parents? And what kind of mother leaves 3 babies in the wild with nothing but a quilt and hope? He remembered. The ruined wagon burnt, ransacked. Not an accident. Not bad luck. Something deliberate. Maybe someone had chased them. Maybe they were hiding from more than just hunger. Back inside, Jed opened a cedar chest near the bed. Inside were folded quilts, a Bible with his wife's name inside, and a pair of his mother's candlesticks. He pulled out a few things: clothes, an old doll he'd once carved but never gave, and laid them by the fireplace. If the children were staying a while, they'd need to feel like this was their space. Just before midnight, he heard movement. Susie stood in the doorway, her hair wild from sleep. She held a folded paper in her hand and whispered, "This was in Mama's coat pocket. I didn't read it." Jed took the letter, feeling the brittle paper between his fingers. The handwriting was tight and rushed, the ink faded by rain and time. To Judge Holloway, San Antonio. "If you find this, it means I didn't make it." Jed didn't finish reading. Not yet. He looked at Susie, whose eyes begged him for something she didn't know how to say. "We're not trouble," she whispered. "We're just trying to finish what Mama started." Jed nodded slowly. "Then we'll finish it together." And for the first time since he'd brought them home, Susie leaned against his side just for a second before retreating into the warmth of the cabin. Jed Carver never imagined the sound of tiny feet on wooden floorboards could soften the edges of his world, but they did. 3 pairs of them, to be exact. Light, cautious, yet slowly growing bolder as the days passed. Each tap and shuffle was a reminder that the ranch, once filled with nothing but wind and creaking hinges, now breathed again. He hadn't planned on keeping them this long. At first, he figured he'd give them a hot meal, a warm bed, and ride them into Cooper's Hollow the next morning to hand them off to the preacher or town doctor. But that night, after reading only the first line of the letter Susie had handed him, "If you find this, it means I didn't make it," Jed folded it up and stuck it in the inside pocket of his coat. Something about that letter, about Susie's quiet eyes, about the littlest girl's voice echoing in his memory, wouldn't let him send them away. Now 4 days in, the children had started adapting to life on the ranch. They didn't ask for toys or complain about chores. In fact, they seemed to crave structure, routine, predictability. Jed caught Susie waking the boys at dawn, brushing their hair with an old fork, and lining them up to wash their faces in the basin before breakfast. She reminded him of someone who'd seen too much to be a child anymore. That morning, as Jed fried bacon and cornmeal cakes on the stove, Eli asked if he could help muck the stalls. His small hands weren't built for pitchforks, but his determination was fierce. Jed handed him a broom instead and said, "Start with the corner. Work toward the light." Susie, meanwhile, had a natural hand with the chickens. She could collect eggs without startling a single hen, and even the rooster, Old Buck, who usually attacked Boots, let her pass in peace. Jed watched from the barn window as she fed them bits of apple, humming something low and familiar. A lullaby, maybe. It stirred something inside him that hurt and healed all at once. The littlest girl, he finally learned her name was May, rarely left his side. She followed him like a silent shadow, never speaking much, but always watching. When he repaired a fence post, she handed him nails. When he stirred beans on the stove, she sat on the counter and swung her legs, occasionally offering sage advice. Like, "Too much pepper makes your tongue cry." That afternoon, Jed brought out Dottie, the oldest and gentlest mule on the ranch. Her back was sway-backed, and her ears drooped more than they used to, but she was patient with kids. He showed Eli and Susie how to approach her, how to speak softly before touching the reins. "Animals listen better than most people," he said. "You speak with your hands and your stillness." Eli climbed into the saddle first, stiff with nerves but beaming with pride. May clapped once and covered her mouth in amazement. Susie helped guide Dottie along the fence line, walking beside her brother like it was her job to make sure nothing went wrong. Watching them made Jed feel something he hadn't felt in a long time, Hope. Later, while the children napped. Beneath a patchwork quilt on the front porch, Jed sat alone with his coffee. The windmill creaked behind him, a familiar rhythm, but everything else felt unfamiliar now. The silence wasn't hollow anymore, it was full of breathing, dreaming, soft little sighs. But not everyone welcomed this change. That evening, two of his ranch hands, Mose and Clive, approached him near the barn. "You planning to keep them?" "Kids, boss?" Mose asked, arms crossed. "Didn't say that," Jed replied evenly. Clive spat in the dirt. "Strays bring trouble. Could be someone comin' lookin', lawmen, or worse." Jed looked them both in the eye. "You're lookin'?" "At the only one who needs to be worried 'bout that." Mose backed off, but Clive didn't. "You can't save everybody." Yet's voice was low, firm. "Ain't trying to. Just feeding 3 kids who didn't ask for the hell they've been through." That night, after supper, Susie quietly placed something beside his plate. It was a hand-drawn picture of pencil lines on brown paper. It showed a tall cowboy with a big hat standing between 3 smaller figures and a dark shadow behind them. Above the cowboy's head, she'd drawn a tiny halo. Jed blinked down at it, throat tight. "You drew this?" he asked. She nodded. "You?" "Gave me a halo?" Susie shrugged. "Mama said heroes don't always look like angels. Sometimes they wear dust." Jed didn't know what to say. For the first time in years, the cabin felt like it wasn't just holding out against the world. It felt like it had life inside it again. He folded the drawing gently and tucked it into the Bible on the mantel next to his wife's name. The snow hadn't come yet, but the wind was colder, now sharper. It had that brittle bite that whispered, "Get ready." Jed Carver had lived through enough Texas winters to know the signs, and he wasn't about to let 3 children weather it unprepared. But as he chopped firewood out back, his thoughts weren't just on the cold. They were on the unanswered questions that hovered over the ranch like gathering storm clouds. He still hadn't read the rest of the letter Susie gave him. It sat folded in his coat pocket, the words pressing against his chest like a quiet reminder. This story ain't over yet. That morning, while May helped Jed sweep the porch, Susie took it upon herself to mend the boys' boots. They were too small and cracked at the solace, but she was resourceful. She tore strips from an old flour sack and used twine from the feed bags. Eli, seated beside her, asked if she thought they'd ever get new ones. Susie just said, "Maybe, if we make these last a little longer." It was when she flipped one of the boots over to examine the heel that she found something strange. There, lodged inside the torn lining beneath the insole, was a folded envelope. The edges were stiff with dried mud. No name on the outside, just smudged ink and the faint scent of smoke. Susie stared at it for a long moment before standing up and calling for Jed. When he saw it, Yet's brow furrowed. "Where'd this come from?" "Inside Eli's boot," Susie said. "It must have been Mama. She hid it there." Jed opened the envelope slowly, careful not to rip it. Inside was a second letter, different handwriting than the one addressed to the judge. This one was more desperate, scribbled quickly, and stained in places that looked suspiciously like dried blood. "To whoever finds this, please help my children. My name is Mabel Reed. My husband Henry was shot defending our homestead near Pine Forks. Men came for the land. Said they had claim papers, but they were forged. We were burned out, chased, hunted like animals. If this reaches a kind soul, please tell the law what happened. Judge Holloway in San Antonio knows our case. I've hidden the land deed and evidence nearby. If I don't survive, please protect Susie, Eli, and May. Tell them I love them. Every second." Jed stared at the page, his fingers trembling slightly as he refolded it. He looked at Susie, whose eyes were already glassy. "You weren't just lost out there," he said quietly. "You were running." She nodded once. Mama said if anything happened, we were to keep walking. She said help would find us if we stayed brave. Did you see the men who attacked you? Susie hesitated, then said, one had a scar on his cheek. Mama called him Briggs. Jed felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. Tully Briggs, a name Jed hadn't heard in years, but one he hadn't forgotten. A land burner, a hired enforcer, and worse known for making disputes disappear across the frontier. Jed had scouted with men like Briggs during the war, but afterward they split ways. Some men went home. Others kept burning. He swallowed hard. Did your mama hide anything else? I don't know, Susie whispered. She talked about a hiding place, said the truth would be safe under the old cross. Jed looked up sharply. What cross? The one near the gulch, she said. She made Daddy build it when we buried our dog last spring. Jed stood, already reaching for his coat. Stay here, he told her. Don't open the door for anyone but me. 2 hours later, Jed was kneeling at the foot of a half-collapsed wooden cross deep in the brush where he'd first found the kids. The earth beneath it was disturbed, not freshly, but not ancient either. He dug carefully, hands raw and cold. What he uncovered wasn't much. A wrapped bundle of cloth, stained and worn. Inside it, he found a rusted tin box containing a deed to a 40-acre parcel outside Pine Forks, gated and signed, but not by the land office. Alongside it, a journal. Mabel Reed's entries, detailing the threats, the men's names, the bribes. Refused. The last entry read, I think tonight's the end. If anyone finds this, please let the law read it. My children's lives depend on it. Jed returned home with the box tucked under his arm, his jaw tight, his mind already working. He was no stranger to injustice. He'd watched men hang for less and others ride free after worse. But this time, it wasn't just strangers. It was his ranch now. His family. That night, after the kids had gone to bed, Jed sat by the fire and opened the folded drawing Susie had made him. The cowboy with a halo. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Lord, he muttered, I don't know what you expect from me, but I reckon you've made it pretty clear. He looked toward the room where the children slept, then down at the journal on his lap. Tomorrow he'd ride into town. And he wouldn't be going alone. The morning sky was the kind that made a man squint, even before the sun peeked over the ridges pale, bone dry, and waiting for something to snap. Jed Carver saddled Thorne with steady hands, but his mind raced like a horse on the run. The bundle tucked inside his saddlebag, the deed, the journal. The letter felt heavier than iron. It was proof of murder, fraud, and stolen land. But it was also a target on his back. Before he left, Jed walked into the kitchen where Susie stood peeling potatoes with May balanced on her hip. I need to ride into Cooper's Hollow, he said. Won't be long. Susie nodded. You tacking the papers? He hesitated. Yeah, I think it's time Judge Holloway saw them. Susie set the knife down slowly, eyes steady. You think they'll try to stop you? I think they already did, he said. Now it's just a matter of who shows up first, the law or the devil. Eli walked in, rubbing sleep from his eyes. I want to come. Jed gave a tired smile. Not this time, bud. I need someone here to look after the girls. Eli straightened his spine like a soldier. Yes, sir. Jed rode out with the wind at his back and suspicion thick in the air. He didn't get more than 5 miles before the first sign of trouble. The general store and Cooper's. Hollow sat crooked on its foundation, but the porch planks were freshly cleaned, and that meant someone new had arrived. Someone who wanted to be noticed. Jed tied Thorne and stepped inside. The smell of tobacco and old salt pork hit him at once, along with the stillness that follows when strangers walk into tight rooms. At the far end, leaning against a barrel of flour with one boot propped up and a glinting belt buckle catching. The light was Tully Briggs. Yet's gut clenched, but his face stayed calm. Tully hadn't changed much. Still wiry as barbed wire, with a deep scar that ran from his temple to his cheekbone like a cruel smile. His eyes locked on Yet's like he'd been waiting. "Well," Tully drawled, tipping his hat, "ain't this a surprise?" Jed Carver. War hero turned chicken farmer. Jed didn't answer. Just picked up a tin of coffee from the shelf and set it on the counter like he had a shopping list to finish. Tully walked closer. "Heard you had company out at that ranch." "3 little." "Strays?" "Couple girls." "1 boy." "You always been a charitable man, Jed?" Jed didn't flinch. "They got names. You don't get to use them." Tully's grin grew colder. "I reckon those kids are sitting on land that don't belong to them. That wagon of theirs? Found burned down near Pine Forks. Sheriff says it was squatters, but folks talk." Jed turned, meeting his gaze fully. "Squatters don't bury their dogs under hand-carved crosses. And they don't carry notarized deeds with their names on, That wiped the smile off Tully's face. "You're poking your nose where—" "It don't belong, Carver," Tully warned. "Best send those brats to the orphan train before things get real unfriendly out there." Jed leaned in close, voice low and steady. "If I see you near my ranch, near those kids, or even near my horse's shadow, I'll put you in the ground so deep your own mama won't find your bones." The room went dead silent. Even the shopkeeper stopped breathing. Tully straightened. Slowly. "Guess we'll see how this plays out." He turned on his heel and walked out, spurs clinking like a metronome counting down. By the time Jed returned to the ranch that evening, the sun was sinking and his back ached from tension. But what he saw when he rode up knocked the breath clean out of him. The children may. Eli and Susie stood at the gate, holding makeshift weapons, a broom, a shovel, and a cast iron pan. They'd pulled Yet's saddle blanket across the front, porch like a curtain, with stones stacked behind it like a fort. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked, half smiling despite himself. Eli puffed his chest out. "We saw a rider. Susie said we better get ready." Jed dismounted, heart swelling. He reached into his coat and handed Susie the second letter. "I met your mother's devil today," he said. "Name's Tully Briggs. He's not gone yet, but he knows we're not scared." Susie didn't blink. "Mama said fear's just the part before you get brave." Jed nodded. "Then we're about there." That night, Jed sat by the fire with the children gathered close. He finally read Mabel Reed's journal aloud, entry by entry, name by name. The truth spilled into the room like light through broken shutters. When he finished, Eli said, "You think the judge will listen?" Jed looked at the fire. "He'll listen. And if he don't, then I'll make sure the whole town hears." The outlaw had returned, but so had something else Jed thought he'd lost a long time ago, a reason to fight. And this time, it wasn't just for land or pride or justice. It was for family. The morning after Yet's confrontation with Tully Briggs, the air over the ranch felt different. Still, quiet, but not in the peaceful way, in the waiting way. The kind of silence that used to settle before a storm or before men charged into battle. Jed Carver knew it well. He rose before sunrise, checking the rifles. One behind the door, one in the barn loft, another in the pantry wrapped in burlap. The children were still asleep, tucked together like puppies under layered quilts, but Susie stirred as he crossed the room. "You think he's coming?" she asked. Jed nodded slowly. "Not today." But soon, Susie didn't flinch. "Will. Be ready." That girl, he thought, was built from iron and fire, and whatever pain life had handed her hadn't broken her, only sharpened her. By mid-morning, he'd sent the children downriver to Widow Campbell's place, a sturdy woman with no-nonsense 12 goats and a shotgun that never missed. She had agreed to keep the kids safe for a few days, and Susie understood without complaint. She packed the journal, the deed, and both letters in a burlap satchel and handed it to Jed. "Just in case something happens," she said. Jed crouched to May's level. "You look after your brother and sister, all right?" May hugged him tight around the neck. "You come back, or we'll come get you." He chuckled softly. "Deal." Once they were safely away, Jed began preparing. Reinforced the barn doors. Hitched the mule wagon to block the path beyond the main gate. Saddled Thorne and tied him by the porch with a feed bag and loose reins. If anything happened, he'd need a fast exit or a fast chase. And then he waited out they came near sunset. 3 riders. Dust clouds behind them. Tully Briggs in front, hat low, rifle visible across his saddle horn. 2 others flanked him, rough men with faces carved from stone and morals even harder. One wore a black bandana, the other a Union coat likely looted. From a dead soldier, Jed stepped off the porch slow and steady, hands visible but nowhere near his holster. He didn't speak first. Tully did. "Well now," he called, voice lazy like a man walking into a poker game. "Thought you might be smart enough to turn those kids over and save yourself a mess." Jed didn't move. "They're with someone. Kind. Somewhere you'll never see." Tully's eyes narrowed. "That so?" Jed took a single step forward. "This land grab you're tied up in, it's over. I've got the deed. The journal. Names. Dates. The judge will see it. So will the town." Tully spat into the dirt. "You think the law gives a damn about poor folks? About dead women? The judge plays golf with the men who own that land now." Jed shrugged. "Then maybe he's not the law I'll show it to." The man in the Union coat moved his horse forward, but Tully raised a hand. "Easy," he said. Then to Jed, "You always were a fool, Carver. War gave you purpose. Now you're clinging to strays and ghosts." Yet's voice dropped like a hammer. "I buried good men in that war. I ain't about to let scum like you walk all over what they died for." Tully's smile cracked. "You just signed your death sentence." Jed didn't blink. "Then draw." A beat of silence. A hawk circled overhead. Wind rustled dry grass between them. Then metal screamed from leather. Tully went for his gun. So did Jed, but Jed was faster. The crack of his rifle echoed through the canyon like thunder. Tully's horse reared, and the outlaw fell backward, shoulder torn open. The other 2 men hesitated just long enough for Jed to drop one more shot. Into the dirt between them. "Next one won't miss," he said. The second man cursed and bolted, reins jerking as he rode hard toward the hills. The one in the coat stared Jed down, then turned and rode after the other. Tully lay in the dirt, groaning, blood pooling in the dust. Jed approached, rifle steady. "You'll live," Jed said coldly, "long enough to testify." Tully laughed. Teeth red. "You're gonna lose anyway. They'll bury the story." Jed leaned in, voice like gravel. "Not this time. 'Cause I'm not alone." An hour later, Jed rode into Cooper's Hollow with Thorne pulling a wounded Tully in a wagon. Behind him, the judge was already there, called in early by a telegraph Jed had sent the day before. Widow Campbell had delivered the journal and letter that morning. When Jed stepped into the courthouse, dragging Tully by the arm, the whole room fell silent. He dropped the outlaw at the judge's feet. "This man killed a father, hunted a mother, burned a wagon. He's working for men stealing land from the dead." The judge opened the journal, scanning the names. "You have proof?" Jed looked him square in the eyes. "I brought it, and I brought witnesses." "You'd best. Listen this time, Judge." And for the first time in a long time, the law looked like it might just work the way it was meant to. The snow came early, not the kind that dances light across rooftops. No, this was the kind that smothered a ranch in silence, sank fence posts under drifts, and turned wagon wheels brittle with frost. By the first week of December, Jed Carver's land looked like it had been carved out of a frozen dream white, still and deadly. The trial was set for the new year. Tully Briggs sat behind iron bars in Cooper's Hollow, nursing a gunshot wound and a growing list of charges. The judge had taken Jed seriously more than he'd expected, and now the case was drawing attention from the surrounding counties. But while the town buzzed with politics and land claims, Yet's focus was back on the ranch. Because Winter didn't care about justice, and it sure didn't wait for redemption. He'd brought the children back home the day after the hearing. Susie had stood tall in the courtroom, her voice clear as glass, describing the night there. Home burned, the men who chased them through the woods, and her mama's last words. The courtroom wept. Even the judge's gavel shook a little when he dismissed her. But now, safe in their new lives, they faced a challenge of a different kind. No. Food growing. Roads impassable. Snowdrifts too high for wagons. Jed rationed supplies, taught Eli how to stack firewood without wasting heat, and had Susie tracking the hens laying patterns like a banker counting coins. May stayed close to the hearth, bundled in every scarf and blanket she could find, dragging her doll behind her like a second shadow. First, they managed. Biscuits with molasses, potato soup stretched thin, jerky in small portions. They made snow angels in the yard and built a scarecrow out of kindling and Yet's old hat. But then, baby Noah, the youngest Reed boy, quiet and rosy-cheeked, grew pale. He started coughing. Then burning with fever, and the food began to run out. Jed had always been resourceful, but the cold slowed everything. The smokehouse froze shut. The root cellar's last turnips had gone soft, and Noah was getting worse by the hour. One night, as the boy lay limp in Susie's lap, skin too hot to touch, Jed made a choice. He stood, pulled on his coat, and loaded Thorn with what little he needed: 2 jars of honey, a blanket, a rifle, and a promise whispered beneath his breath, "I'll come back. Don't let the fire die." Susie didn't argue. She just stood up, hugged him hard, and whispered, "If he wakes up, I'll tell him you're riding fast." Jed rode for 3 towns over, where the doctor lived near Elk Hollow. Through sleet, through wind, through ground so icy it cracked beneath Thorn's hooves. Snow whipped across his face, burned his eyes, froze his gloves to the reins. At one point, he collapsed behind a boulder and thought about staying there. But then he remembered May's voice, whispering, "You come back, or we come get you." And that was enough. 2 days later, he returned, covered in ice, beard frozen, one eye nearly swollen shut, but he had medicine. He had soup bones and cornmeal tied to his saddle, and he had a letter from the Elk Hollow doctor himself, a man who said if Judge Holloway didn't give the Reed kids full custody under Yet's care, he'd ride in and demand it himself. Susie met him on the porch, tears pouring down her cheeks, but she was smiling. "He's breathing steady," she whispered. "He's gonna be okay." Jed staggered inside and knelt by Noah's side. The boy's face was flushed, but the fever had broken. Eli brought a cup of broth and pressed it into Yet's hands. May climbed into his lap like she'd been waiting every minute since he left. "You didn't break your promise," she whispered sleepily. Jed shook his head. "Didn't plan to." He slept for a full day after that, right there on the floor with the children curled around him like a pack-warm, safe hole. When he woke, the storm had passed. Blue skies stretched out over the hills. The drifts began to melt. And with the thaw came something deeper, something brighter than sunlight. Hope. For the first time in a long time, the house didn't feel borrowed or broken. It felt like home. They survived that winter not because the storm showed mercy, but because they showed each other how to fight through it. Because a cowboy who once rode alone now had something worth riding for. and 3 children who had once begged for scraps had a father who would ride through a blizzard to bring them back life. Together, they faced a season that tried to break them. And together, they endured. Spring arrived not with a fanfare, but with a quiet shift mud instead of snow, the smell of wild onions in the breeze, and the distant, welcome sound of creek water running again. On Jed Carver's ranch, winter had left its mark in cracked wood, lean supplies, and the memory of cold nights too quiet for comfort. But the Reed children? They bloomed. Susie's face softened again. Her brow, once constantly furrowed from fear, now smoothed when she brushed May's hair or helped Eli read from an old almanac they'd turned into a spelling book. Elliot was filling out, taller and steadier. No longer the wild-eyed boy who flinched at sudden sounds. He spoke louder now, laughed. Even. And May? She giggled in her sleep and chased butterflies like the world had never heard her. But something still hung between them and Jed. Not silence. Not distrust. Distance. They were safe. Yes. Fed, warm, loved. But Jed had never once called them his. Not aloud, and they hadn't called him anything but Mr. Jed. Not even sir. Just a respectful distance. Until the day the preacher came. It started with a letter. A clean, folded piece of parchment bearing the county seal. Holloway's verdict. Jed read it alone on the porch. The words were simple, final, official. Guardianship of Susanna, Elijah, May Reed granted in full to Jedediah Carver, veteran of the Union Army, landholder, and responsible guardian. There were signatures, a gold stamp, and a line at the bottom that said, custody permanent unless formally challenged by bloodkin. Jed stared at that paper for a long while. Then he folded it and walked inside. Susie and Eli were patching the garden fence. May was building a soup castle out of mud. Jed called them all into the house. He took a deep breath. I got a letter from the judge. They tensed. Old habits don't die quick. It's good, he added quickly. He said, you all can stay. Not just for now. Not just till spring. For good. You're mine if you want to be. Silence. Then Eli's voice low. You mean we don't have to go nowhere ever again? Jed nodded. No trains. No new homes. No more letters? Nope, Jed said. Just chores and biscuits and whatever else this place throws at us. May blinked. Even if I spill molasses again, even then. The room was quiet for another long second. Jed felt his heart thumping like a drum. Then Susie walked up, took the letter, and folded it again, neater than he had, and placed it on the mantel, next to the carving of Yet's late wife and the Bible no one touched. She looked up at him and said one word, Daddy. Jed didn't know if he smiled or cried first. Maybe both. Eli grinned. Can I call you that too? Jed opened his arms. You better. May was last. She patted over, hugged his knee, and said, You smell like biscuits and horses. Jed laughed so hard he nearly dropped her. That Sunday, the preacher arrived in his wagon, trailing dust behind his wide-brimmed hat. He had come to confirm the arrangement, make it known to the church and town record. As he sat at the table with a pen and Bible open, he asked, Do you intend to raise these children as your own, Mr. Carver? Jed placed a steady hand on the table. They've already raised me. The preacher chuckled. Not quite how the Lord wrote it, but I reckon he'll allow it. He turned to the children. And you, young ones? You accept Mr. Carver as your father? May raised her hand. I already told him he's not allowed to die without asking me first. Susie smirked. That's a yes. Eli just said, I've been carving his initials into my boots for a week. Jed cleared his throat, trying not to choke on the lump forming there. The preacher inked the final page. Then it's settled. You're a family. The rest of that day passed in a kind of dream. They ate peach pie for supper and burned the last of the old letters in the fireplace, Not to forget, but to let go. And that night, for the first time, Jed tucked each of them in like it was the most natural thing in the world. May looked up at him sleepily. You were never lonely, were you? Jed brushed her hair back gently. I didn't know I was, until you showed up. She smiled, closed her eyes, and said, I'm glad we picked you. He stood there long after she fell asleep, the weight of fatherhood sitting on his shoulders not like a burden, but like a coat that finally fit. For a while, things were quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes after war and heartbreak. The ranch found its rhythm again: spring chores, muddy boots at the door, laughter in the kitchen. Susie took to sewing curtains with wildflower patterns. Eli fashioned a slingshot from a bent horseshoe and shot pebbles at tin cans till his aim could shame a deputy. May followed the hens like she was their shepherd, naming them things like Queen Egabeth and Lady Peck. Jed Carver? He smiled more, slept deeper, walked straighter. He'd spent years not knowing what he needed. Turns out it had brown curls, a quick temper, and called him Daddy. But peace out here was never meant to last. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a man too polished for dust. It was a warm Sunday morning when he rode in clean boots, black suit, a fine horse slick with travel. Jed watched from the porch as the man dismounted, adjusted his tie, and knocked on the fence rail instead of the front door. Jedediah Carver? He called, voice smooth as snake oil. Jed rose slowly. That's me. The man extended a hand, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. Name's Percival Grant. I represent the San Antonio Land and Commerce Bureau. Jed didn't shake the hand. What do you want? The man's expression didn't change. Just paperwork, Mr. Carver. A few little inconsistencies in your land boundary registration. A judge's signature that didn't file correctly. You understand cleaning up the books? Yet's jaw tightened. That judge also signed custody over those kids. Grant's eyes flicked toward the barn, where Susie and Eli peeked from behind the planks. That's not my concern. The children aren't under dispute. So what is? Grant smiled thinly. Your property. Turns out it might sit partially on an unclaimed buffer zone once tied to the Reed homestead. Land that's now part of a larger acquisition deal involving Pine Fork Timber and Western Rail. Jed stepped down off the porch, boots hitting dirt with a finality that made the crows stop cawing. You're telling me that after all the lies, murder, forged deeds after we brought it to the court, and after the judge ruled, you're still here trying to take something that ain't yours? Grant blinked, mildly annoyed. Mr. Carver, let's not turn this into a standoff. I'm just a messenger. Yet's hand twitched near his hip, though his holster was empty. You picked the wrong porch. Grant took a slow breath, then reached into his saddlebag. I was instructed to offer compensation before escalating matters. Sign this. He pulled out a folded legal document, and you walk away. 50 acres north, near the river bend. Fertile land. Less complicated. Jed didn't even look at the paper. My land feeds my children. It buries our dead. That cross near the gulch? That's where their mother rests. I ain't signing anything. Grant's smile finally cracked. Then I'll return with lawmen. And a writ. Maybe next week. Maybe tomorrow. I suggest you start packing. He mounted his horse, tipped his hat mockingly to the children, and rode off without a glance back. That evening, Jed called a meeting around the kitchen table. Susie's eyes were sharp. He's coming back, isn't he? Jed nodded. He's not a gunslinger. He's worse. He's legal. Eli frowned. What do we do? Jed unrolled a hand-drawn map of the ranch and pointed to the far edge. We prove this land is ours. Every inch. And we make sure if he shows up with men, they see we're not afraid. Susie reached under the bench and pulled out the old journal, the one their mother had kept. There's more than just words. In here, she wrote about the creek line, The fence Daddy built, the date of the landmarkers. Jed smiled. Then that's what we'll use. The next day, while May painted wooden signs that read Reed Carver Land, Jed and the older two walked the full property line. They hammered old nails into trees, dug up fence posts their father had once buried, and placed stones where boundary markers should have been long ago. They worked like their lives depended on it, because in a way, they did. That night, as the oil lamp flickered in the window, Jed tucked May in and kissed her forehead. "You scared, Daddy?" she asked. He thought a moment. Then, "I used to be scared of being alone. Not anymore." May smiled and whispered, "Good, 'cause I ain't letting them take my daddy." He sat by the fire long after the house went still, watching the embers glow low and fierce. They could bring lawmen. They could bring papers, but this wasn't just land anymore. It was home. And no man in a suit was going to take it without a fight. The morning they came was the kind of beautiful that made your bones ache. Blue skies, birds in flight, wildflowers poking up beside the barn like the land didn't know it was being threatened. But Jed Carver knew. He saw the dust cloud. Long before the wagon rolled in, 4 men rode alongside it, deputies with brass on their coats and cold in their eyes. And in the back, sitting straight like a man used to getting his way, was Percival Grant. Jed stood waiting at the fence line, arms crossed, rifle slung casually over one shoulder. He didn't say a word as they stopped. The lead deputy dismounted. Unrolling a scroll of paper, "Jedediah Carver?" he asked. Jed gave a single nod. "This is an official writ from the county records office. Claims the property line has been misfiled. You are instructed to vacate the portion overlapping the Fagin Sevwidjene. Read plot effective immediately. All structures and persons must be off within 72 hours. Jed didn't look at the paper. "Got 3 kids in that house," he said calmly. "This writ says you're throwing them out too?" The deputy hesitated. Grant didn't. "The children are not your concern," Grant said, climbing down from the wagon. "This is about boundaries, Mr. Carver, nothing personal." Jed stepped forward, his voice quiet but firm enough to split wood. "It's real personal when you're trying to steal what their mama died protecting." The deputy shifted, uneasy now. Grant rolled his eyes. "Don't make this difficult." "But—" Just then, the cabin door creaked open. Susie stepped out first, wearing her mother's old shawl and holding her head high. Eli followed, holding May's hand. Behind them, Widow Campbell arrived on horseback with her shotgun resting across the saddle. 2 ranchers from the next county rode in behind her men. Jed had fought beside. Men who knew the smell of smoke and injustice. They formed a loose line beside Jed. Grant blinked. "Throne." Jed spoke loud enough for the wind to carry. "You can try and redraw lines on a map, but you can't erase blood. You can't unbury a mother. And you sure as hell can't intimidate me in front of my children." Grant's face turned red. "You're defying a legal writ." Jed pulled the leather-bound journal from his coat, the one with Mabel Reed's writing, and held it up. "This ranch isn't just staked in soil. It's staked in her words, her truth, her death. I got testimony. I got landmarkers. I got a judge willing to listen. And I got a whole town full of folks who'll speak in that courtroom if this turns ugly." The deputy shifted again, glancing at the other men. Grant scowled. "You think anyone's going to side with a cowboy and 3 orphans?" And then tiny, fierce May stepped forward and yelled, "We're not orphans anymore." Silence. It dropped like a hammer. Jed looked at her. His voice cracked just a little. "No, you're not." The deputy looked from the girl to Jed, then at Grant. "Sir," he muttered, "maybe we ought to bring this back to the courthouse. Let the judge sort it, fair and proper." Grant sputtered. "Are you?" "He has no legal standing." But the deputies were already backing off. One of them nodded politely to Susie. Another tipped his hat to Widow Campbell. The wagon turned. Hooves stamped. Dust rose again, and this time it rolled away from the ranch, not toward it. Grant sat stiff as a plank, steam rising off him like a pot left too long on the stove. But even he knew when a fight was lost, when the last rider disappeared. Over the hill, the porch exploded into cheers. Susie hugged Jed so tight his ribs ached. Eli whooped and ran to ring the dinner bell. May climbed the fence, yelled, "We won," and nearly fell off in her excitement. Jed stood still, taking it all in. Not the land, not the cattle, not even the victory. The family. His family, that night. The lanterns burned warm. Supper was beans and biscuits and laughter. Susie sang an old lullaby, and Jed didn't even try to hide the tears. When the children were asleep, Widow Campbell clinked her mug against his. "You stood alone today," she said. "But you weren't really alone." Jed looked down the hallway where the children slept. "No," he said, "not anymore." And for the first time in his long, weathered life, he didn't feel like a man fighting to survive. He felt like a fille. Man who had something worth living for, something worth protecting, a home, a purpose. A family that had chosen him.